You know what your problem is, sweetheart? My wife announced to our entire backyard full of neighbors, her wine glass raised like she was giving a toast. You think small. You've always thought small. Probably because everything about you is small. The laughter that followed, polite, uncomfortable, but real, is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. That was the night I finally saw my marriage for exactly what it had always been. 6 months later, I watched her cry in a restaurant parking lot while my girlfriend held my hand inside. I didn't feel sorry. I felt free. My name is Thomas. I'm 43 years old, and for 11 years I was married to a woman named Diana. We met at a mutual friend's wedding in Charlotte when I was 31 and she was 28. She was beautiful in that effortless way that makes a man believe he's somehow gotten lucky beyond what he deserves. Dark hair, quick laugh, the kind of confidence that fills a room. I was a civil engineer with a steady job at a mid-sized infrastructure firm. She was just starting out in residential real estate. We dated for a year and a half, got married in a small ceremony on the North Carolina coast, and moved into a 3-bedroom house in a suburb outside of Raleigh. For the first few years, things were good. Not perfect, but good. We had a son, Caleb, who was born 2 years into the marriage. And for a while, that small person with his sticky fingers and enormous laugh made everything feel worth it. The shift in my wife happened gradually, the way water erodes stone. You don't notice it until the shape is completely different. Her career took off around year 4. She landed a partnership at a boutique luxury real estate firm, started closing deals on properties that cost more than I'd earn in a decade, and began moving in circles that I, with my project blueprints and site inspection schedules, simply didn't fit into. I was proud of her. I told her that often. What I didn't realize was that my pride had no value to her anymore. She had stopped needing my admiration around the same time she stopped asking about my day. The comments started small. Honey, you should let me handle the finances. You know numbers make your eyes glaze over. Said at dinner with her parents, with a smile that made everyone think she was being playful. Tommy's very dedicated to his work. It's just not the kind of work people write articles about, you know? Said to her real estate colleagues at a Christmas party while I stood 3 feet away holding her coat. I absorbed each one quietly. I told myself she didn't mean it. I told myself successful people sometimes develop sharp edges. I told myself that the man who loved her owed her the benefit of the doubt. I stopped playing tennis after she attended one of my weekend matches and commented to my friend's wife, loud enough for several people to hear, that I ran like a man who had never quite learned how his own legs worked. I stopped cooking dinner, something I had genuinely loved, after she invited her broker colleagues over for a weeknight meal, and spent the entire evening making jokes about how she had to translate my recipes from disaster to edible. The guitar I had played since college got moved to the garage after she told Caleb while tucking him in that Daddy was better at building bridges than making music, and maybe some people just weren't meant for certain things. Caleb was 7 years old. He repeated it to me the next morning with complete innocence, and I smiled and told him Mommy was probably right. What I understand now, after months of therapy, is that abuse like this is designed to feel reasonable. Each individual comment, taken alone, sounds like a bad joke, a rough day, a partner who lacks tact. It's only when you line them up, year after year, that you see the architecture of it. The deliberate, systematic dismantling of a person's self-worth until they are grateful just to be kept. The backyard barbecue happened on a Saturday in July. It was a neighborhood block party, the kind we hosted every summer, and I had spent the better part of the previous 2 days cleaning the yard, setting up the smoker, marinating ribs, and buying enough beer and sparkling water to cover every preference. Around 40 people came. Diana moved through the crowd the way she moved through everything. Magnetic, polished, performing. I grilled refreshed drinks, chased Caleb away from the neighbors' flower beds, and tried to enjoy myself. The comment came near the end of the evening. A group had gathered near the patio, and Diana was holding court the way she loved to, telling a story about a client who had lowballed a stunning property in North Hills only to lose it to a cash buyer by 48 hours. Someone asked her what the biggest mistake buyers made, and she launched into an animated answer. Then one of the neighbors, a man named Craig who had a habit of asking questions that felt more like tests, turned to me and said, "Tom, what about you? What do you think is the biggest mistake people make?" He meant it harmlessly. He was talking about anything, life, money, whatever came to mind. Before I could answer, Diana turned to face me with that particular smile, the one I had learned to dread, and said, "Oh, Craig, don't ask Tom about big mistakes. He's more of a small-scale thinker. Bridges, sidewalks, drainage ditches. You know what they say. Some people build the roads, and some people actually go places. She raised her glass. 3 or 4 people laughed. A few looked away. Our neighbor Susan, who had known us for 6 years, caught my eye with an expression that was equal parts pity and embarrassment. I stood there with my tongs in my hand and my son 20 feet away on the swing set, and I smiled. I walked back to the grill. I turned the ribs. I breathed slowly through my nose, and I made a decision. Quiet and final. Somewhere deep in my chest, I am done. The following Monday, Diana left her laptop open on the kitchen counter before taking Caleb to his summer reading program. She had done this hundreds of times. I had never once looked at anything she didn't show me. That morning, something made me stop. Maybe it was the way she had kissed my cheek before leaving. Too deliberate. Too performed. Like something she was doing for the benefit of an audience that wasn't there. I set down my coffee cup and looked at the screen. Her email was open. Near the top of the inbox was a thread with a subject line that read, "Thursday, same place." The sender's name was Marcus Hale. I knew that name. Marcus Hale was her business partner at the firm. The co-listing agent she mentioned constantly. The one she called brilliant. The one she said just understood how to read people in a way that apparently I never had. My hands felt cold as I clicked. The thread went back 7 months. I read it with the methodical attention of a man whose entire professional life depended on identifying structural flaws before they became catastrophes. I read it the way I read blueprints, looking for the load-bearing details, the things that, once found, could not be unfound. The messages were unambiguous. Not just an affair, but a relationship. Inside jokes, references to trips I had been told were client dinners. A weekend at a resort in Asheville that she had claimed was a broker's conference. One message from him, sent in March, read, "You deserve someone who actually sees how extraordinary you are, not someone who thinks small." She had replied, "I know. I'm working on the exit." I was working on the exit. Not a confession. Not a moment of doubt. A logistical item, like a property she was listing. I closed the laptop. I finished my coffee standing at the sink looking out at the backyard where the smoke rings from Saturday's grill had long since dissolved into the summer air. Then I went to my home office, closed the door, and began making a list. The first call was to my friend David. We had been friends since college. He was the kind of man who answered the phone on the second ring and asked no unnecessary questions. I told him I needed a place to stay for a few weeks. He said, "Guest room's made up. You want to talk about it?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Okay. Beer's in the fridge." The second call was to a family law attorney whose name I had gotten from a colleague 2 years ago, filed away in the back of my mind the way you file away information you hope you never need. I scheduled a consultation for Wednesday. My voice was steady. I was mildly surprised by that. That week, I moved carefully. I opened a personal checking account at a credit union on the other side of town. I transferred my half of our joint savings, an amount I had calculated over several evenings with the same precision I applied to structural load calculations. I wasn't trying to punish her financially. I was trying to not be left with nothing. I cataloged what was mine. My tools, my father's old woodworking equipment in the garage, Caleb's school photos I had printed myself and framed, the cast iron skillet my mother had given me when I moved into my first apartment, the furniture, the art, the house itself. Those were negotiable. My self-respect was not. The hardest part of that week was being present for Caleb. He was 9. Perceptive the way children of unhappy homes often become. On Wednesday evening, he climbed onto my lap while I was reading and said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told him I was working through some grown-up stuff. He nodded seriously and said, "I love you, Dad." I held him for a long time after that. Whatever happened between Diana and me, that part, that small, certain, irreplaceable part, was going to survive intact. I chose Friday evening for the conversation. Diana had come home later than expected, which no longer surprised me. Her expression carrying that particular lightness that I now understood was not happiness from a good day at work. I had made dinner. Pasta. Nothing elaborate. Caleb was at his grandmother's for the weekend, which I had arranged on purpose. Some things a 9-year-old should not witness. We sat down. She talked about a closing she had scheduled for the following week, a property in the Cary area, something about a bidding situation. I listened. I let her finish. Then I placed a manila folder on the table between us. "I need to talk to you about something," I said. She looked at the folder the way people look at something they already know is going to be bad. "What is that?" "Printed copies of your email thread with Marcus Hale." going back to December. The color in her face did something I had never seen before. Not a blush. The opposite, a kind of withdrawal, as though the blood had somewhere more important to be. You went through my... Yes, I said. I did, after 11 years of trusting you completely. I finally looked. I'm sorry it took me that long. She tried 3 separate approaches in the following 10 minutes. The first was denial, which collapsed quickly once I opened the folder and referenced specific dates and locations. The second was minimization. It wasn't what it looked like. It had been an emotional thing more than a physical one. I was blowing it out of proportion. I waited through that one in silence. The third was the turn I had been expecting. Tears, and the suggestion that the reason she had looked elsewhere was because I had never truly understood her, never matched her ambition, never made her feel like she was with someone who was going somewhere. I've supported everything you built, I said. I was proud of you. I said so, constantly. What you're describing is not being understood. I think what you mean is that I didn't perform for you. I didn't compete with you. I just loved you. And at some point that stopped being enough. She stared at me. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a brief absence of the performance. Then it returned. So what do you want, Thomas? A standing ovation for being a decent husband? That's the bare minimum. I want a divorce, I said. My lawyer will be in touch early next week. She did not see it coming. I spent 11 years absorbing her assessments of me. Small-scale thinker, limited ambition, a man who built ditches while others went places. And she had come to believe them as fully as she had intended me to. It had not occurred to her that the man she had spent years quietly reducing might have made a plan. I picked up the duffel bag I had left by the back door that morning, walked to my car, and drove to David's apartment. That night my phone began its work. The first text came at 9:47 p.m. Tom, please come home and talk to me like an adult. The second at 10:15, I know you're upset, but throwing away 11 years over one mistake is not rational. By midnight, the tone had migrated from injured to threatening. I'll make sure my attorney knows about your financial accounts. And then, around 2 a.m., back to something that resembled desperation. You're my husband, and I love you. That's real even if other things weren't. I turned the phone face down and slept better than I had in years. The campaign she ran over the following 10 days was, in retrospect, a masterclass in manipulation. Which made sense, because real estate had trained her well. Day 1, she appeared at my office. I worked on the 14th floor of a building with a front desk that required visitor sign-in. She somehow made it to the elevator bank before security intercepted her. My assistant came to find me looking genuinely apologetic. I told her it wasn't her fault and asked her to have security escort my wife from the premises. The words my wife felt like they belonged to someone else's life already. Day 2, she called my mother. This one I hadn't fully anticipated. My mother is 71, sharp as ever, and fiercely protective. When I called her that evening to explain, she listened for a long time before saying, I've watched that woman talk to you for 11 years, Thomas. I never said anything because you seemed committed to making it work. But I want you to know, I always saw it. She paused. And I want you to know that I am very, very glad you left. Day 3, she sent flowers to David's apartment. A large arrangement with a card that read, Tell him I'm sorry. David texted me a photo and added, What do you want me to do with these? I told him to enjoy them. Day 4, her attorney made contact with mine regarding Caleb's custody arrangement. This was the dimension of the situation that I had thought about most carefully. I was not interested in punishing Diana through our son. Caleb deserved both his parents. And whatever Diana's failures as a wife, her love for him was genuine. Of that I was certain. My attorney advised me to document everything, stay consistent, and let the legal process do its work. I took that advice seriously. Day 5, Diana drained one of our joint accounts. A secondary account my attorney had anticipated and already advised me to deplete first. She got less than she expected. Her attorney called mine and described it as a hostile financial act. My attorney pointed out, with the particular calm of a person who has seen everything, that the documented 7-month affair provided considerable context for my client's protective measures. Day 6. I returned to the house with my attorney present to collect remaining personal items. Caleb's artwork from every year of school, framed. My grandfather's watch. The cast iron skillet. A box of books Diana had always found pretentious and made a point of moving to the back of shelves when guests came over. Diana was there. Makeup precise. Eyes carrying that particular redness that I was starting to recognize as strategic. She followed me through the house, making quiet appeals that escalated each time I failed to respond. When I picked up the last box and turned to leave, she grabbed my arm. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," she said. "You know that, right? You think you're walking away from something. You're actually just going back to being nothing. Because that's what you were before me. Nothing." I looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for being honest," I said. Finally, I walked out. The divorce took 4 months to finalize. Diana attempted 3 separate delays, each of which her own attorney eventually counseled against given the weight of available evidence. The settlement was fair and unremarkable. The house was listed and sold, proceeds divided, a custody agreement that gave Caleb stability and maintained relationships with both sides of his family. My attorney told me I had conducted myself unusually well throughout the process. I told her I'd had a lot of practice staying calm in difficult situations. She laughed and said that was a very civil engineer thing to say. I found an apartment downtown on the 4th floor of a building with high ceilings and big windows that looked out over a park. The first weekend I spent there alone, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. I felt something I had difficulty naming at first. It took me 3 days to identify it. The absence of tension, not happiness, not yet, but the removal of a constant background pressure that I had lived under so long I had stopped registering it as abnormal. The silence in those rooms was not lonely. It was clean. I bought a couch Diana would have called aggressively masculine. I hung 2 of my grandfather's old woodworking prints that had lived in a box in our garage for 6 years. I set up the guitar in the corner of the living room. Not the garage, not a closet, the living room. And the first evening I played it, I was rusty and a little clumsy. And I didn't care at all. At work, something changed that I hadn't expected. My company had been pursuing a major infrastructure contract with the state, a flood mitigation project covering 3 counties, the largest bid we put together in over a decade. I'd been involved peripherally, contributing pieces of technical analysis, but holding back from leading, the way I had held back from most things for most of the previous decade. 2 weeks after I moved into my apartment, my project director called me into his office and said he wanted me to front the final technical presentation to the state review board. "You've been carrying half this project for 2 years and letting other people take the podium," he said. "I don't know what changed for you recently, but whatever it is, use it." We won the contract. I stood at the front of a room of state officials and delivered 60 slides of technical documentation with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing your work without apology. My director shook my hand afterward and told me a senior project manager position had opened and he was putting my name forward. I thanked him and walked to my car and sat in the parking garage for a few minutes doing nothing in particular, feeling something I could only describe as the slow return of something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Therapy helped in ways I hadn't anticipated. My therapist was a quiet, precise man named Dr. Okafor who had a habit of asking questions that sounded simple until you tried to answer them. In our 3rd session, he asked me when I had first started adjusting my behavior to avoid Diana's disapproval. I began to answer and then stopped, because the honest answer was within the first year of our marriage. Before Caleb. Before the real estate partnership. Almost from the beginning, I had been quietly editing myself into a shape she would find less disappointing. He called it accommodation as survival strategy. He explained that it was an extremely common response to sustained emotional criticism, and that it frequently became so automatic that the person doing it stopped recognizing it as a choice. "The good news," he said, "is that what was learned can be unlearned." My friendship with David deepened during those months. He told me one evening, over beer at his kitchen table, that he had never liked Diana, not as an angry revelation, just as a quiet, matter-of-fact statement. "The way she talked about you when you weren't in the room," he said, "like you were a project she'd taken on. I always thought you deserved better, but it wasn't my place." I told him I wished he'd said something. He said, "Would you have listened?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "Probably not." I met Patricia at a professional development conference in Durham, 8 months after I moved out. She was a structural engineer with a firm based in Greensboro, presenting a session on coastal infrastructure resilience that I attended primarily because it covered material directly relevant to my state project. She had the kind of focused intelligence that shows up in the way someone talks about their work, not performing expertise, just inhabiting it. We ended up at the same table at the evening reception and talked for 3 hours about bridge retrofitting in North Carolina soil composition and, eventually, about everything else. She was 40, divorced herself for 2 years, with a teenage daughter who played competitive volleyball, and apparently had opinions about most things. She laughed easily and asked direct questions, and when I said something she disagreed with, she said so without wrapping it in anything. The first time she disagreed with me. Something minor about drainage calculations? I sat there for a moment, adjusting to the novelty of a woman who challenged my thinking with zero implication that I was inadequate. It was just a disagreement. Normal, clean, respectful. We dated for 3 months before she met Caleb. He assessed her with the seriousness of a 9-year-old who understands more than he lets on, asked her 2 questions about what kind of building she designed, and then invited her to play a card game he had recently become obsessed with. She beat him twice and let him win the 3rd round with just enough subtlety that he spent the whole drive home telling me she was actually pretty good. It was, by any measure, a successful introduction. The evening I ran into Diana. I was not looking for it and did not want it. But I had learned by then that the things that close chapters rarely arrive on schedule. Patricia and I were at a restaurant in downtown Raleigh. A new place that had opened near my building. Contemporary Southern food. The kind of menu that takes itself seriously without being insufferable. We had a reservation at 7. We were at the bar waiting for our table when I recognized her across the room. Diana was with a group of 4 people. Marcus Hale was not among them. She was laughing at something, holding her wine glass the same way she always had. And then she turned and we made eye contact across the noise of a Friday evening restaurant. The expression that moved through her face lasted only a few seconds, but it contained, in sequence, surprise, something that might have been pain, a flash of the old performance impulse, the gathering of composure. And then, when Patricia turned to say something to me and I smiled at her, something that was neither performance nor composure, but just a person confronting the specific grief of understanding too late what they had. She looked away. I returned to my conversation. Our table was called 3 minutes later. The dinner was excellent. Patricia ordered the short rib and told me a story about a site visit that had gone sideways in a way that had her laughing hard enough that the table next to us started smiling sympathetically. I ordered the trout. We split a bottle of something good. When we left, the night was warm for October. Patricia took my arm as we walked to the car, and I thought about the last 11 years the way you think about weather once you're already inside. Aware of it, understanding its dimensions, but no longer standing in it. My attorney called the following Tuesday to tell me the final paperwork had cleared and everything was complete. I thanked her and hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment. Then I picked up the guitar, sat down on the couch Diana would have hated, and played until I was better than rusty. Not perfect, but better. Caleb came for his weekend on Friday. He dumped his backpack by the door, raided the refrigerator, and spent the first 20 minutes telling me, in comprehensive detail, about a book he'd been assigned in school that he initially hated and had somehow become invested in despite himself. I made dinner. We watched a movie. He fell asleep on the couch, and I covered him with a blanket and sat in the chair across from him in the good quiet of my own apartment, thinking that I had built something, small and real and entirely mine, and that small was not the problem anyone had ever tried to tell me was. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.